The chain clinked against concrete as Liberty shifted her swollen belly, desperate to find relief from the blistering Arizona heat. 6 days without proper water, her tongue cracked and bleeding. The abandoned textile factory's metal walls amplified the sun's punishment like an oven. Pregnant and alone. Mason Walker's hands trembled as he lowered his binoculars. 20 yards away, the German shepherd's once proud frame was now skeletal, ribs protruding beneath a dull coat. Only her eyes retained dignity, amber and intelligent, meeting his gaze with unexpected clarity. What stopped him cold wasn't her condition, though God knows that was bad enough. It was what she was doing. With methodical determination, Liberty was gathering scattered debris, cardboard, frayed rope, a tattered blanket, arranging them around her body. She wasn't just waiting to die, she was building a nest for puppies that would arrive any moment. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Millfield, Arizona wasn't the kind of place people came to. It was the kind of place they left. The dusty town of 12,000 souls sat baking in the desert heat, its glory days of textile manufacturing long since faded into memory. At the edge of town, the abandoned Monarch Mills complex stood as a rusting monument to better times, chain-link fences failing to keep determined teenagers and desperate vagrants from finding their way inside. Mason Walker preferred it that way. Forgotten, isolated, left alone. At 42, the former Marine had built a quiet life in a modest craftsman on the outskirts of town, where the desert began to reclaim the land. His weathered hands found purpose in carpentry, restoring furniture in the workshop behind his house. Clients left pieces at the front door and picked them up when finished. Some weeks, he spoke to no one but Eleanor Green, the 74-year-old widow next door, who brought him casseroles, despite his protests. The nightmares had never left him. 8 years since Afghanistan, and still Mason woke most nights drenched in sweat, the echo of explosions ringing in his ears. His wife Caroline had been his anchor, but cancer took her 3 years ago. Since then, he'd drifted further from shore. Liberty had been someone's anchor once, too. The German shepherd's military tattoo in her ear told that story, a decorated K-9 who had served with distinction in Afghanistan. Now she lay chained in the abandoned factory, her once muscular frame weakened by neglect and the 7 puppies she carried. The scars across her muzzle and back spoke of cruelty that had followed her service. Richard Thompson had made sure everyone in town knew the dog was his. Millfield's most successful real estate developer, with a smile for every occasion and a dark emptiness behind his eyes. What no one knew was how that emptiness had formed when his younger brother died in Afghanistan, or how he'd channeled his grief into punishment of the animal he irrationally blamed. Sarah Mitchell had seen Liberty only once, when Richard brought her to the veterinary clinic 6 months ago. The 38-year-old vet and single mother had immediately recognized the signs of abuse but lacked the legal grounds to intervene. She'd called animal control, but Richard's influence ensured the case disappeared. Eleanor Green had lived in Millfield all her life. The former military nurse carried the wisdom of her 74 years with straightforward dignity. What she knew about Liberty, she kept to herself, for now. It wasn't the first time the nightmare had dragged Mason from sleep. The explosion, the screams, the weight of his friend dying in his arms. After 8 years, these ghosts should have faded. Instead, they seemed to grow more vivid, more insistent. This time, though, something was different. When he woke, soaked in sweat at 3:17 a.m., it wasn't just the echo of the past that haunted him, but a strange, urgent sense that someone was calling for help. By sunrise, Mason found himself driving aimlessly, following a pull he couldn't explain. His weathered Ford pickup slowed as he passed the abandoned Monarch Mills. He'd never paid much attention to the place before, but today something drew his eyes to a gap in the fence. Almost without thinking, he parked on the gravelly shoulder and climbed out, the morning heat already building. The factory's interior was a graveyard of machinery and forgotten ambition. Dust motes danced in sunbeams that speared through broken windows. Mason moved cautiously, years of military training never quite forgotten. That's when he heard it. A soft whine, barely audible but unmistakably distressed. In the loading dock area, he found her. A German shepherd, once magnificent, now skeletal, chained to a rusted pipe. The heavy chain allowed only a few feet of movement, and nearby sat a filthy bowl with barely an inch of stagnant water. The dog watched him, amber eyes alert despite her condition. Her swollen belly made Mason's jaw clench with anger. "Hey there, girl," he whispered, approaching slowly with an open palm. The dog didn't growl or cower as he'd expected. Instead, she stretched her neck toward him, nostrils flaring to catch his scent. When his hand finally touched her head, she leaned into his touch with a trust that made his throat tighten. The chain was secured with a heavy padlock. Mason tugged, testing its strength, but it was solid. "I'll be back," he promised, looking into those intelligent eyes. "I'm going to help you." In town, it took just 3 questions at the diner to learn who owned the dog. Richard Thompson was well known in Millfield, the kind of local success story people pointed to with a mixture of pride and resentment. Mason found him at his real estate office, a renovated Victorian on Main Street. "She's on my property," Thompson said flatly when Mason explained what he'd found. The man's expensive suit and manicured nails seemed at odds with the hardness in his eyes. "The dog is dangerous. I'm keeping her there for everyone's safety until I decide what to do with her." "She's pregnant and dying," Mason countered, struggling to keep his voice level. "Whatever your issue is with her—" "My issue," Thompson interrupted, standing, "is that she's a failed military dog that couldn't do her job. I'm teaching her a lesson about consequences." His smile never reached his eyes. "Now, unless you want to be charged with trespassing, I suggest you forget what you saw." Mason left before he did something he'd regret, his hands shaking with rage. At the hardware store, he bought a gallon jug of water and dog food. By noon, he was back at the factory, this time with supplies. Liberty, he'd decided to call her that, lapped eagerly at the fresh water he poured. He sat with her while she ate, talking softly about nothing in particular, just so she could hear a kind human voice. When he examined her more closely, he saw old scars beneath her fur and fresh abrasions where the chain had rubbed her neck raw. Over the next week, Mason visited Liberty twice daily, bringing food and water, cleaning her makeshift shelter as best he could. He tried bolt cutters on the chain, but the hardened steel wouldn't yield. Each day, her pregnancy advanced, and her condition worsened, despite his care. "We need to get you out of here before those puppies come," he told her on the 7th day, rubbing her ears. Liberty had grown to recognize his truck's engine, greeting him with a tail wag despite her discomfort. That evening, Mason drove to the veterinary clinic just as it was closing. Sarah Mitchell was locking up when he approached. "I need advice," he said, after introducing himself. "There's a pregnant German shepherd being kept chained at the old factory. I think she's close to delivering." Sarah's professional demeanor faltered slightly. "Is her owner Richard Thompson?" When Mason nodded, she sighed. "I've reported him before. Nothing happened." "She needs help," Mason insisted. What happens if she goes into labor out there alone? She could lose the puppies, Sarah said quietly. She could die herself. But without owner consent or proof of imminent danger, my hands are tied, legally. Driving home, Mason felt the weight of helplessness. At a stoplight, Eleanor Green pulled alongside in her ancient Buick. Recognizing him, she motioned for him to roll down his window. "You look troubled, young man," she called over, her silver hair gleaming in the sunset. "Everything all right?" Before he could answer, the sky to the west flashed with lightning. The monsoon season was arriving early this year. By midnight, the storm had unleashed its fury. Rain hammered Mason's roof as he paced his living room, thinking of liberty exposed to the elements. When lightning struck close enough to shake his windows, he grabbed his keys. The road to the factory was already beginning to flood in low-lying areas. Mason's headlights caught sheets of rain as he pulled up to the familiar gap in the fence. Flashlight in hand, he fought his way through the downpour to the loading dock. Liberty was huddled in her makeshift nest, trembling as thunder crashed overhead. When she saw Mason, she struggled to her feet, her swollen belly nearly brushing the ground. A puddle was forming around her, rising with each passing minute. Mason knelt beside her, shielding her with his body. "I'm getting you out of here tonight," he promised. "No matter what." As if understanding, Liberty pressed her muzzle into his palm. And then, with a low whine that raised the hair on Mason's neck, she lay down and began to pant rhythmically. The puppies were coming. The storm transformed the Arizona night into chaos. Rain hammered the factory's metal roof like artillery fire, each thunderclap causing Liberty to flinch. Water began seeping through the loading dock floor, forming shallow pools that grew steadily deeper. Mason knelt beside the German shepherd, shielding her from drips coming through the ceiling, his hand steady on her heaving flank. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though his own heart raced. The nearest bolt cutters strong enough for her chain were in his truck, but he couldn't leave her now, not with labor starting and floodwater rising. Liberty's panting intensified, her amber eyes fixed on Mason with an intensity that communicated more clearly than words. Time was running out. The water had reached 2 inches deep around her makeshift nest, soaking the cardboard she'd gathered. "Damn it all," Mason muttered, pulling out his phone. 3 missed calls from Eleanor glowed on the screen, but more importantly, no signal bars. The storm had knocked out service. A crash echoed from somewhere in the factory's depths, metal falling or a window giving way to the wind's assault. Liberty's ears pricked forward, her body tensing despite her condition. Her training never fully abandoned, even now. Mason made his decision. "I'm getting the bolt cutters. 2 minutes, Liberty. Just hold on." He squeezed her muzzle gently, then splashed through deepening water toward the exit. Outside, the world had dissolved into sheets of driving rain. Mason sprinted to his truck, rummaging in the toolbox until his fingers closed around the bolt cutters. As he turned back toward the factory, headlights swept across the lot. A black SUV pulled up, its wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. The driver's door opened, and a security guard in a rain slicker emerged, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "This is private property," the man called out, hand resting suggestively near his hip. "Mr. Thompson's orders are clear. No one enters." Mason recognized him. Dave Mercer, former sheriff's deputy, now working private security for Thompson Enterprises. "There's a dog inside giving birth," Mason shouted over the storm. "Water's rising. She'll drown if we don't get her out." "The dog stays where Mr. Thompson put her," Mercer replied, unmoved. "You need to leave now." For a moment, Mason was transported back to Afghanistan. Another standoff, another impossible choice. The bolt cutters felt heavy in his hand. "I can't do that." "Then I'll have to escort you off the property." Mercer advanced, hand now clearly gripping a holstered weapon. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The security guard instinctively ducked. Mason didn't hesitate. He turned and ran back into the factory, Mercer's shouts lost to the storm's fury. Inside, the water had risen to 4 inches. Liberty was struggling to keep her nest above the flood, her contractions visibly intensifying. Mason waded to her side, positioning the bolt cutters around the chain near the wall anchor. "Almost there, girl," he promised, straining against the hardened steel. The first attempt failed, the cutters slipping off the wet metal. Behind him, a flashlight beam swept across the loading dock entrance. "Walker! This is criminal trespass and attempted theft!" Mercer's voice echoed through the cavernous space. Mason ignored him, repositioning the cutters and applying all his strength. This time the chain gave slightly. Liberty whined, a contraction racking her body. "Final warning!" Mercer was closer now, his footsteps splashing through the water. With a guttural roar of effort, Mason compressed the bolt cutter handles. The chain link snapped with a metallic ping. Liberty was still tethered by a shorter length, but it was no longer secured to the wall. "Get on the ground now!" Mercer was 10 feet away, weapon drawn. Instead of complying, Mason scooped Liberty into his arms, chain and all. The pregnant dog was shockingly light, her once powerful frame diminished by months of neglect. She didn't struggle, seeming to understand he was her only hope. "She's in labor," Mason said calmly, turning to face the security guard. "If you want to shoot a man saving a pregnant dog from drowning, that's your call." Mercer's flashlight beam illuminated Liberty's condition, her protruding ribs, the swollen belly, the desperate eyes. His weapon wavered. In that moment of hesitation, the factory's ancient electrical system finally surrendered to the storm. A transformer exploded somewhere outside, plunging the building into total darkness. Mason didn't wait. He moved by memory through the blackness, Liberty trembling against his chest. By the time Mercer's flashlight found them again, Mason was halfway to the exit. "Thompson will press charges," the guard called after him, but made no move to pursue. Outside, the rain continued unabated. Mason laid Liberty across his truck's back seat, then climbed into the driver's side, soaked to the bone. As he turned the key, his mind raced through options. The veterinary clinic would be closed. The nearest emergency animal hospital was in Phoenix, an hour away. Liberty couldn't wait that long. As the windshield wipers fought against the downpour, Mason's mind flashed back to Kandahar Province, 2015. His unit had been pinned down during a sandstorm, their K9 operator wounded. The German shepherd with them, so similar to Liberty, had dragged the radio to them through enemy fire, allowing them to call for evacuation. He blinked away the memory, focusing on the flooded road ahead. That dog had saved lives with her intelligence and courage. Liberty deserved the same chance. 20 minutes later, Mason pulled into his driveway, the storm showing no signs of abating. Eleanor's porch light was on next door, a beacon in the darkness. He carried Liberty to his front door, her breathing increasingly labored. Inside, he quickly arranged blankets into a makeshift whelping box in his living room. Liberty circled the nest anxiously before settling, her eyes never leaving Mason as he toweled her dry as gently as possible. The remaining length of chain still hung from her collar, a brutal reminder of her captivity. Mason found bolt cutters in his workshop and removed the rest of the chain, revealing raw skin beneath. "No more chains," he promised, stroking her head. "You're free now, Liberty." His phone had regained service. Mason dialed Sarah Mitchell's number, praying she'd answer at this hour. "Hello?" Her voice was thick with sleep. "It's Mason Walker. I've got the pregnant German Shepherd from the factory. She's in labor, and I think she's in trouble." Sarah was instantly alert. "Address?" 10 minutes later, headlights swept across Mason's windows as Sarah's SUV pulled up. She hurried to the door, medical bag in hand, hair hastily pulled back in a ponytail. Mason led her to Liberty, who was now panting heavily, her flanks heaving with contractions. Sarah knelt beside the dog, her professional demeanor taking over as she began her examination. "How long has she been in labor?" "About an hour," Mason replied, hovering anxiously. Sarah's face grew serious as she checked Liberty's vital signs. "Her pulse is rapid, and she's severely dehydrated. This isn't going to be easy." She looked up at Mason. "You know Thompson will come after you for taking her." "Let him try," Mason said, his voice hard. Outside, thunder rumbled in agreement. Liberty whined, pressing her head against Mason's hand as another contraction seized her. In her eyes, Mason saw not just pain, but a profound trust that squeezed his heart like a fist. "I'm calling in reinforcements," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "We're going to need help to get these puppies safely delivered." As the storm raged outside, Liberty began the fight of her life inside. A battle for herself and her unborn puppies, finally unchained, but far from safe. Sarah worked with practiced efficiency, setting up a makeshift veterinary station in Mason's living room. She hung an IV bag from a floor lamp, deftly inserting the needle into Liberty's foreleg while murmuring reassurances. The German Shepherd's trusting eyes never left Mason, who sat cross-legged beside her, stroking her head. "She's severely malnourished and dehydrated," Sarah explained, checking Liberty's gums. "The puppies might be underweight, but we'll do everything we can." A knock at the door startled them both. Mason opened it to find Eleanor Green standing on his porch, rain-soaked but determined, carrying a large plastic container. "Heard the commotion?" the elderly woman said matter-of-factly, brushing past him. "Figured you might need these." She set down the container, revealing clean towels, a heating pad, and puppy formula. "Navy nurse for 30 years, she explained to Sarah's questioning look. "Helped deliver more than just human babies in my time." Liberty's labor progressed slowly. Sarah monitored her contractions while Mason kept the dog calm, his hand steady on her heaving flank. Eleanor prepared the whelping area, arranging towels and setting up the heating pad for the puppies who would soon arrive. "How did you know what to bring?" Mason asked Eleanor during a quiet moment. The older woman's eyes crinkled. "Been watching that factory through my binoculars. Knew that poor girl was pregnant weeks ago. Been waiting for someone with sense to do something about it." She patted Mason's shoulder. "Knew it'd be you eventually." As the storm continued to rage outside, Mason's mind drifted back to Afghanistan. The sandstorm that had nearly buried them alive. The German Shepherd who had saved his unit, so similar to Liberty, with those same intelligent amber eyes. "I was deployed with a K-9 team in Kandahar," Mason found himself saying, the words coming unbidden after years of silence. "Dog named Duke, best explosives detection K-9 in the regiment." Sarah looked up from checking Liberty's progress. "Military dogs are incredible. My brother served with them in Iraq." Mason nodded, continuing to stroke Liberty's head as she panted through another contraction. "Duke's handler was my best friend, Jack Brennan. We'd been together since basic." He swallowed hard. "During a patrol, Duke alerted to an IED, saved our whole unit. But on the way back to base, we were ambushed." The room fell silent, except for Liberty's labored breathing and the rain hammering against the windows. "Jack didn't make it," Mason finished quietly. "Duke survived, but he was wounded." I always wondered what happened to him after they shipped him home. Eleanor's weathered hand squeezed his shoulder. Some wounds don't show on the outside, son. Liberty whined, a more urgent sound than before. Sarah moved quickly to examine her. First puppy's coming, she announced. Mason, you'll need to help her. Talk to her. Keep her calm. Mason positioned himself at Liberty's head, his voice steady as he encouraged her. You're doing great, Liberty. You're safe now. You can do this. With a final push, the first puppy emerged, tiny, wet, and still. Sarah worked swiftly, clearing the membrane from its face, rubbing the little body vigorously with a towel. After a heart-stopping moment, the puppy gasped and began to squirm, its high-pitched squeal filling the room. It's a boy, Sarah said, smiling as she handed the puppy to Eleanor, who placed him on the heating pad. Liberty tried to turn to see her firstborn, but another contraction seized her. The second puppy came more easily, followed quickly by a third and fourth, all alive, all surprisingly strong given their mother's condition. Between deliveries, Mason's phone rang. The caller ID showed the local police department. Mr. Walker, came the stern voice of Chief Peterson when Mason answered. I've got Richard Thompson here claiming you broke into his property and stole his dog. Care to explain? Mason glanced at Liberty, now nursing her 4 puppies, while Sarah monitored her for signs of the next delivery. I did what anyone with a conscience would do, he replied evenly. The dog was chained in a flooding building in labor. She would have drowned along with her puppies. Thompson wants to press charges for criminal trespass and theft. Tell Thompson I'll see him in court. Better yet, tell him to come see what his property looks like after months of neglect and abuse. The police chief sighed audibly. Listen, Mason, I'm not unsympathetic, but... Chief, Mason interrupted, his voice hardening. That dog has a military tattoo in her ear. Did Thompson mention that? Did he tell you she's a decorated service animal? A pause. No, he didn't. Then maybe you should ask him how he came to possess a military working dog. Because I guarantee you, the Department of Defense doesn't typically sell their canines to civilians who chain them in abandoned factories. After Mason hung up, Sarah gave him an appraising look. That was impressive. And you're right about the tattoo. It's a military identification. I noticed it earlier. Liberty tensed again as the 5th puppy began to crown. This one came slowly, backwards, causing the dog to yelp in pain. Sarah worked carefully, helping to guide the puppy out. Breech presentation, she muttered, her forehead creased with concentration. Come on, little one. When the puppy finally emerged, it was larger than the others, a female with a distinctive white star on her chest. Like her siblings, she began nursing almost immediately once cleaned and placed with her mother. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, the thunder now distant rumbles. Liberty rested between contractions, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but still alert. 2 more to go, I think, Sarah said, checking the dog's abdomen. She's doing remarkably well considering her condition. Eleanor returned from the kitchen with coffee for everyone. Dogs are resilient creatures, she said, handing Mason a steaming mug. Like people that way, can endure far more than seems possible. As they waited for the next puppies, Mason found a laptop and began searching for information on military working dogs. What he discovered made his blood boil. Liberty was a decorated war dog, he told the others, turning the screen to show them. 3 tours in Afghanistan, specialized in IED detection, saved at least a dozen lives according to this article. Sarah peered at the screen. Does it say what happened to her afterward? Mason scrolled down. She was injured in her final tour, supposed to be retired with honors and adopted by a veteran family. He frowned. Then the record just stops. No mention of how she ended up with Thompson. Eleanor's face had gone strangely still. "What unit was she with?" she asked quietly. "3rd Battalion, 5th Marines," Mason replied. "Why?" Before Eleanor could answer, Liberty whined sharply. The 6th puppy was coming, and from Sarah's sudden frown, something was wrong. "The puppy's stuck," she said tensely. "I need to help her." She worked quickly, her hands gentle but firm as she assisted Liberty. The puppy that finally emerged was smaller than the others, barely moving. Sarah acted swiftly, clearing its airways and rubbing it vigorously. The tiny creature eventually gave a weak cry, its movements feeble compared to its siblings. "He'll need extra care," Sarah said, placing the runt carefully with Liberty, who immediately began cleaning him with focused determination. A vehicle pulled into the driveway, headlights sweeping across the living room windows. Mason tensed, moving protectively closer to Liberty. "That'll be Richard," Eleanor said grimly. "I'd recognize the sound of that overpriced SUV anywhere." The pounding on the front door came seconds later, aggressive and demanding. Mason opened it to find Richard Thompson standing on his porch, flanked by Chief Peterson. Thompson's expensive suit was rumpled, his normally perfect hair disheveled. His eyes burned with a cold fury that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "I want my dog back," Thompson said without preamble. "Now!" Chief Peterson looked uncomfortable. "Mason, I'm hoping we can resolve this without—" "She's in the middle of delivering puppies," Mason cut in. "She's not going anywhere." Thompson tried to push past him. "That animal is my property. You had no right—" "Actually," Sarah's voice came from behind Mason, calm and professional, "as a veterinarian, I have a legal obligation to report animal abuse, which I'm prepared to do, Mr. Thompson, with extensive documentation of Liberty's condition." Thompson's face reddened. "Her name is not Liberty." "Is not? And this man broke into private property and stole from me. That's a crime, last I checked." Eleanor appeared at Mason's side, her small frame somehow imposing despite her age. "Richard Thompson," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had known him since childhood. "You stop this foolishness right now. That dog was dying. Mason saved her life, and the lives of her puppies." For a moment Thompson seemed to falter under Eleanor's stern gaze. Then his jaw hardened. "The law is the law. Chief, I insist you do your job." Chief Peterson sighed heavily. "Mason, can we at least come in and talk about this like civilized folks?" Mason hesitated, then stepped aside. The chief entered first, followed by Thompson, whose eyes immediately locked onto Liberty and her puppies in the living room. Something unreadable flashed across his face, anger certainly, but beneath it something more complex. "See for yourself," Mason said, gesturing to Liberty's emaciated form, the raw skin around her neck where the chain had been, the puppies nursing desperately. "Is this how a valuable animal should be treated?" Thompson looked away, his jaw working. "She was my brother's dog," he said finally, his voice tight. "She let him die." The room fell silent. Liberty looked up at Thompson, her amber eyes showing no fear, only a deep exhaustion. "What did you say?" Mason asked quietly. "My brother, Staff Sergeant Kevin Thompson," Richard replied, his composure cracking. "He was her handler in Afghanistan. She was supposed to protect him. That was her job, but she didn't. He died, and she came home." Eleanor made a small sound of recognition. "Kevin Thompson. I remember now. 2015, wasn't it?" Richard nodded stiffly. They gave me his personal effects, included his canine partner, too traumatized for further service, they said, as if I cared about the animal that failed my brother. Mason felt the room tilt slightly. Staff Sergeant Kevin Thompson. The name clicked into place in his memory. One of the Marines in a neighboring unit. He hadn't known him personally, but he remembered the incident, an IED that the dog had somehow missed, or so the story went. Before Mason could process this information, Liberty tensed again. The seventh and final puppy was coming. Sarah moved quickly to assist, but it was clear immediately that something was wrong. The puppy was large and positioned incorrectly, causing Liberty visible distress. "I need more light," Sarah said urgently. Eleanor moved a lamp closer while Mason knelt beside Liberty, speaking softly to keep her calm. Even Thompson seemed transfixed by the scene, his anger momentarily forgotten as Sarah worked to save the puppy. When it finally emerged, it wasn't moving or breathing. "Stillborn," Sarah said quietly, cradling the lifeless form. Liberty raised her head, whining anxiously. With a strength that seemed impossible given her weakened state, she pulled herself toward the stillborn puppy, nudging it with her nose. "Let her say goodbye," Sarah murmured, placing the tiny body where Liberty could reach it. What happened next stunned everyone in the room. Liberty began methodically licking the puppy, focusing intently on its chest and face. Her movements were deliberate, almost like a form of CPR. Minutes passed, the room silent except for the sound of Liberty's determined efforts. Then, impossibly, the puppy twitched. A tiny leg moved, then another. A faint squeak emerged from its mouth. Liberty continued her ministrations until the puppy was squirming weakly, miraculous life restored by its mother's refusal to give up. "My God," Chief Peterson whispered. Sarah carefully placed the revived puppy with its siblings. Liberty settled back, exhausted but visibly relieved, her eyes still alert despite the ordeal she'd endured. Thompson stared at the scene, his composure thoroughly broken. "She wouldn't give up," he said almost to himself. "Even after everything—" Mason stood, facing Thompson directly. "Liberty didn't fail your brother," he said firmly. "War failed him. And you've been punishing her for something that was never her fault." Thompson's gaze remained fixed on Liberty and her puppies. "Kevin loved that dog," he said quietly. "Said she was the best partner he'd ever had. I needed something to blame." Eleanor stepped forward, placing a weathered hand on Thompson's arm. "Grief can make monsters of the best of us, Richard. But it's never too late to make things right." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the tiny sounds of the nursing puppies. Then Thompson straightened, composing himself. "I'll drop the charges," he said stiffly. "The dog, Liberty, she can stay here. It's better for the puppies anyway." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. My brother would have hated what I did to her," he added, not looking back. "Maybe that's why I did it." After Thompson and the chief departed, Mason sat beside Liberty, gently stroking her head as she nursed her 7 puppies, all alive, all fighting to survive, just as their mother had. "You knew, didn't you?" he asked Eleanor, who was arranging blankets around the new family. "About Liberty's connection to Kevin Thompson?" The older woman nodded slowly. "I suspected. I volunteer with the Veterans Affairs Office. Remember all the boys who go off to war and those who don't come back." She smiled sadly. Richard never recovered from losing his brother. Grief can curdle into something ugly if you don't face it head on. Sarah finished packing her medical supplies. "Liberty is stable for now, but she'll need careful monitoring. The puppies, too, especially the runt and the last one. I'll come back tomorrow to check on them." As Sarah prepared to leave, Mason walked her to the door. "Thank you," he said simply. "I couldn't have done this without you." She smiled, fatigue evident in her eyes. "You did the hard part, getting her out of that factory. The rest was just my job." She hesitated, though I have to admit, this was one of the more dramatic house calls I've made. After Sarah left, Eleanor settled into Mason's armchair with a cup of tea, clearly having no intention of leaving. "Someone needs to keep an eye on this new family while you get some rest," she insisted. "I've got the first watch." Mason didn't argue. The adrenaline that had carried him through the night was fading, leaving bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. He stretched out on the couch, close enough to reach Liberty if she needed him. As he drifted toward sleep, Liberty's amber eyes met his, communicating something that transcended words: gratitude, trust, and perhaps a recognition deeper than either of them could understand. In saving her, Mason felt something shift within himself, a crack in the armor he'd built around his heart since Afghanistan, since losing Jack. Outside, dawn was breaking, the storm clouds finally parting to reveal a sky washed clean. Inside, exhausted but safe, mother and puppies slept while Mason kept watch, the first peaceful morning in a long, long time. 3 days passed in a blur of round-the-clock care. Liberty grew stronger with proper nutrition and hydration, though her recovery would be slow. The puppies thrived under their mother's attentive care, all except the runt, who struggled to compete with his larger siblings for nursing access. Mason found himself bottle-feeding the tiny male every 2 hours, a task that consumed his days and nights, but felt strangely fulfilling. Sarah visited daily, checking on Liberty's recovery and the puppy's development. This morning, she arrived with a scanner to check for a microchip, something they hadn't been able to do during the emergency delivery. "Most military dogs are chipped," she explained, running the device over Liberty's shoulder blades. After a moment, it beeped. "Got it." Sarah jotted down the identification number and pulled out her phone. "I'll contact the Department of Defense K-9 unit. They should have records on her." Mason nodded, cradling the runt puppy against his chest with a bottle. The tiny creature's eyes were still closed, its body barely larger than Mason's palm. "What are the chances they'll want her back?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Military working dogs are usually retired after their service," Sarah replied, her eyes softening as she watched him feed the puppy. "Especially ones who've been through trauma. But we'll need to find out what actually happened. Thompson's story doesn't add up." Eleanor arrived as Sarah was leaving, carrying a casserole and fresh puppy pads. The elderly woman had appointed herself auxiliary caregiver, spending hours each day helping with the puppies while regaling Mason with stories from her nursing days. "How's our little warrior today?" she asked, setting down her burdens and immediately moving to check on Liberty. "Getting stronger," Mason replied. "Drinking water on her own now, eating well." "And you?" Eleanor fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "When's the last time you slept more than an hour at a stretch?" Mason shrugged, avoiding her eyes. The truth was, he was exhausted. But closing his eyes meant facing nightmares, both old and new. Afghanistan. Jack dying in his arms. And now, Liberty chained in that factory, suffering. "I'm fine," he said, returning the now sleeping runt to his place beside Liberty. Eleanor made a skeptical sound but didn't press further. "I'll watch them for a few hours. Go shower at least. You're starting to ripen." Mason complied, the hot water momentarily washing away the fatigue that clung to him like a second skin. As steam filled the bathroom, his mind drifted back to Afghanistan, to the moment he'd first met Jack and his canine partner. "This is Duke," Jack had said proudly, the German shepherd sitting attentively at his side. "Best nose in the regiment. He can smell explosives buried 3 feet underground." Duke had proven his worth countless times, saving their unit from hidden IEDs and ambushes, until that final day when everything went wrong. A sharp bark jolted Mason from the memory. He shut off the water and quickly wrapped a towel around his waist, heart pounding. Liberty never barked. He found Eleanor standing near the front door, holding the largest female puppy. Liberty was on her feet, the first time she'd left her whelping box since giving birth, her posture alert despite her weakness. Through the window, Mason saw a police cruiser pulling into his driveway. "Stay with them," he told Eleanor, quickly pulling on clothes. When he opened the door, Chief Peterson stood on the porch with a man in a military uniform. "Mason Walker?" the uniformed man asked. "Master Sergeant Neil Harrington, United States Marine Corps K-9 Unit." Mason's military training kicked in automatically. He straightened, meeting the man's gaze directly. "What can I do for you, Master Sergeant?" "I'm here about a military working dog designated K435, call sign Shadow. I understand she's in your possession." "If you mean Liberty, yes, she's here," Mason replied. "She just gave birth to 7 puppies after being rescued from severe neglect." Harrington's expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened. "I'd like to see the dog, sir." Mason hesitated, then stepped aside. "She's been through a lot. Please don't upset her." Inside, Liberty had returned to her puppies, body tense as the stranger in uniform approached. Harrington knelt at a respectful distance, speaking in a low, gentle tone. "Hey there, Shadow. Been a long time, girl." To Mason's surprise, Liberty's tail gave a slight wag of recognition. Harrington looked at her condition. The still visible ribs, the healing wounds around her neck, her overall emaciated state, and his professional demeanor cracked. "Jesus," he muttered. "What happened to her?" Mason explained everything, finding Liberty chained in the abandoned factory, her desperate condition, Thompson's claim that she had belonged to his brother. "Staff Sergeant Kevin Thompson," Harrington nodded. "I remember the case. Shadow was his partner for 2 tours, one of our best explosive detection teams." "Richard Thompson said the dog failed to protect his brother," Mason said. "That's why he—" Harrington's face darkened. "That's not what happened. Staff Sergeant Thompson stepped on an IED in an area that hadn't been cleared yet. Shadow wasn't even with him at that moment. She'd been sent ahead to scout a different route." He shook his head. "She actually dragged herself back to him despite her own injuries, stayed with his body until the medevac arrived." The room fell silent except for the tiny squeaks of the nursing puppies. After her recovery, she was supposed to be retired and adopted by Thompson's family. His brother specifically requested it in his will. When Richard Thompson came to claim her, we had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Harrington's jaw tightened. "We've been looking for her for months. Thompson reported her escaped shortly after taking custody." Chief Peterson, who had been listening silently, cleared his throat. "That would constitute filing a false police report, at minimum." "Among other charges," Harrington agreed grimly. Liberty whined softly, drawing everyone's attention. The runt had wiggled away from the nursing group, and she was gently nudging him back into position. "What happens now?" Mason asked, dreading the answer. In just a few days, Liberty and her puppies had become inexplicably important to him. "Officially, Shadow is still military property," Harrington said. "But given her condition and the puppies—" He hesitated. The proper channels for military working dog retirement and adoption can be navigated, Mr. Walker, especially for someone with your service record. Mason blinked in surprise. You know about my service? Chief Peterson filled me in, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Purple Heart recipient. Harrington's expression softened slightly. The kind of person we look for in our adoption program. Hope flickered in Mason's chest, but he tamped it down. What about Thompson? He could contest any adoption. Let me worry about Richard Thompson, Chief Peterson interjected. His typically mild demeanor hardened. Filing false reports, animal cruelty, we've got plenty to work with. As if summoned by his name, a vehicle pulled up outside. Thompson's black SUV. Mason tensed, but Harrington held up a calming hand. Let me handle this, the master sergeant said, moving toward the door. Richard Thompson strode up the walkway with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Seeing the police cruiser and Harrington's uniformed presence, he faltered momentarily before recovering. I see the cavalry's arrived, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Come to reclaim government property? Mr. Thompson, Harrington replied evenly. I'd like to discuss the circumstances surrounding Canine Shadow's discharge into your care. There's nothing to discuss. The dog was given to me after my brother's death. What I did with my property afterwards is my business. Except you reported her missing, Chief Peterson cut in. Claimed she escaped. Filed an official police report to that effect. Thompson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She did escape. I later found her and decided to keep her at the factory for security purposes. In chains, without adequate food, water, or shelter. Mason couldn't contain himself any longer. While pregnant? I wasn't aware of her condition, Thompson said dismissively. Harrington stepped closer, his voice dropping. Mr. Thompson, I knew your brother. He was an exemplary Marine and canine handler who specifically requested that Shadow be given to his family upon his death. To be cared for, not tortured as some twisted form of revenge. Thompson's composure finally cracked. That dog was supposed to protect him. That was her only job, and she failed. Shadow was clearing a different building when the IED detonated, Harrington countered. She couldn't have prevented what happened, and despite her own injuries, she dragged herself back to your brother's body and protected it until help arrived. She nearly died trying to reach him. Thompson's face went pale. That's not what I was told. It's in the official report, Harrington replied, which you would have received with her discharge papers, the papers you signed acknowledging your responsibility to provide proper care. Inside the house, a commotion erupted. Eleanor's voice called out urgently, Mason! The runt, he's not breathing! Mason rushed back inside to find Liberty frantically nosing the smallest puppy, who lay still and unresponsive. Sarah, who had returned during the confrontation outside, was already performing tiny chest compressions with 2 fingers. He's aspirated milk, she explained tensely. His airway is blocked. Mason knelt beside them, heart pounding. The tiny puppy's body was limp, his usually pink skin turning dusky. What can I do? Hold him upside down, head lower than his body, Sarah instructed. I need to clear his airway. With trembling hands, Mason took the puppy, supporting his tiny head as Sarah had shown him. The runt felt impossibly fragile, a life barely begun now slipping away. Sarah used a suction bulb to clear fluid from his mouth and nose. Come on, little guy, Mason whispered. Fight! Liberty watched with desperate attention, whining softly. The other puppies sensed the tension, squirming restlessly in their nest, After what felt like an eternity, the puppy gave a weak cough, expelling more fluid. Sarah continued the gentle suction until his airway was clear. When she finally nodded at Mason, he carefully returned the runt to Liberty, who immediately began cleaning him with focused determination. "He'll need to be monitored closely," Sarah said, her own hands shaking slightly from the intensity of the moment. "But he's breathing normally now." Mason exhaled, only then realizing he'd been holding his breath. The room slowly came back into focus. Eleanor watching with tears in her eyes, Chief Peterson and Harrington standing in the doorway, and behind them, Thompson, his face unreadable. "She wouldn't give up on him," Thompson said quietly. "Just like she wouldn't give up on Kevin." No one spoke. The only sounds were Liberty's gentle licking and the runt's gradually strengthening breaths. Thompson stepped forward hesitantly. "May I—" He gestured toward Liberty. Mason's protective instinct flared, but he nodded stiffly. Thompson approached slowly, kneeling at a respectful distance from the whelping box. Liberty watched him warily, her body positioned protectively around her puppies. "I was wrong," Thompson said, his voice barely audible. "Kevin would be ashamed of what I did to you." He looked up at Harrington. "Was she really with him? At the end?" The Master Sergeant nodded solemnly. "The medevac team had to sedate her to get her to leave his side. She was seriously injured herself, shrapnel wounds, concussion, but she wouldn't leave him." Thompson bowed his head, shoulders slumping. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet. "I'd like to drop all charges," he said to Chief Peterson. "And," he hesitated, turning to Mason, "I'd like to help with Liberty's recovery. Pay for her care, the puppies too." Mason studied the man, searching for any trace of deception. Finding none, he nodded curtly. "She needs surgery for her teeth, dental issues from chewing on that chain, and proper nutrition to recover her strength." "Whatever she needs," Thompson agreed. As the tension in the room gradually subsided, Mason felt a wave of exhaustion crash over him. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the puppy's crisis was fading, leaving him lightheaded. The room tilted slightly, voices becoming distant. "Mason?" Sarah's concerned face swam before him. "When's the last time you slept?" He couldn't answer. The past 3 days blurred together in an endless cycle of feeding puppies, tending to Liberty, and fighting his own demons whenever he closed his eyes. "That's what I thought," Sarah said, helping him to the couch. "You're experiencing exhaustion. You need rest. Actual sleep, not just closing your eyes for 20 minutes between puppy feedings." Mason wanted to protest, but his body betrayed him. His eyes felt weighted, impossible to keep open. "The runt," he managed to say. "He needs feeding every 2 hours." "I've got it covered," Sarah assured him. "Eleanor and I will take shifts. Even Richard has volunteered to help." "Can't trust," Mason began. "I'll be here too," Harrington cut in. "Military working dogs are my responsibility. I'm not going anywhere until we sort this out properly." Mason's resistance crumbled. As his eyes closed, he felt Liberty's warm presence nearby. She had somehow managed to climb onto the couch beside him, her head resting against his leg despite the effort it must have cost her weakened body. "Rest, son," Eleanor's voice came from somewhere above him. "You've earned it." As consciousness slipped away, Mason's hand found Liberty's head, fingers gently stroking her ears. For the first time in years, he surrendered completely to sleep, the nightmares held at bay by the steadying presence of the dog, who had, improbably, become his anchor. He dreamed of Afghanistan, Not the firefights or explosions that usually haunted him, but the quiet moments between missions. Jack laughing as Duke chased a tennis ball across the dusty base yard, the simple camaraderie of soldiers and their loyal canine partners. In the dream, Jack smiled at him across the years. "You found her," he said, though Mason didn't understand what he meant. "You found each other." Mason slept for 15 straight hours, the deepest rest he'd experienced since returning from war. When he finally woke, disoriented and stiff, the scene that greeted him seemed impossible. Sarah dozing in the armchair, Eleanor knitting peacefully in the corner, and Richard Thompson, of all people, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the whelping box, carefully bottle-feeding the runt puppy. Liberty, still on the couch beside Mason, thumped her tail in greeting. Her amber eyes, once clouded with pain and fear, now held a clear, steadfast trust that squeezed something in Mason's chest. "Welcome back," Eleanor said softly. "Quite a team you've assembled here." Mason looked around at the unlikely gathering, the stern-faced Master Sergeant now asleep in a kitchen chair, the veterinarian who had worked miracles, the elderly neighbor who had seen through to the heart of things, and even Thompson, the former enemy now gently tending to the weakest puppy. At the center of it all was Liberty, her broken body healing, her spirit undefeated. In saving her, Mason realized, he might have finally found the path to saving himself. A week after Liberty's rescue, life settled into an exhausting but rewarding routine. The puppies grew stronger daily, their eyes beginning to open, tiny paws batting at the air. All except the runt, whose progress remained painfully slow. Though he now nursed without assistance, his growth lagged noticeably behind his siblings. Mason had taken to calling the runt Scout, for the determined way he navigated the whelping box despite his limitations. The name had stuck, the others adopting it naturally. Scout had become the focal point of their collective concern, his survival still uncertain. That morning, Mason woke before dawn to check on the puppies. Liberty acknowledged him with a soft whine, but remained curled protectively around her litter. All seemed well, the tiny bodies rising and falling with steady breaths. Even Scout had made it through another night. Mason made coffee, the house quiet except for the puppy's occasional squeaks. Sarah had finally gone home to her daughter after days of around-the-clock assistance. Eleanor would arrive later with groceries. Master Sergeant Harrington had returned to his base but called daily for updates, the adoption paperwork for Liberty already initiated. Only Thompson remained a regular presence, appearing each evening after work to help with the puppies, his transformation from adversary to ally still unsettling to Mason. They worked together in uneasy silence, united only by their concern for Liberty and her litter. The doorbell rang just as Mason poured his coffee. Thompson stood on the porch, not in his usual business suit but casual clothes, his expression grave. "We need to talk," he said, without preamble. Mason stepped aside to let him in, noting the dark circles under the man's eyes. Something had happened. "I've been going through Kevin's things," Thompson said, settling heavily on the couch. "His deployment journals, letters home, things I couldn't bear to look at after." Mason waited, sensing this wasn't a conversation to rush. He wrote about Shadow Liberty constantly, how she saved their unit multiple times, how he trusted her more than most humans. Thompson's voice cracked slightly. The last entry was 3 days before the IED. He wrote that if anything happened to him, he wanted me to take her because we'd understand each other. The weight of those words hung in the air between them. "I failed him," Thompson continued. "Failed her. Used her as a punching bag for my grief instead of the connection to my brother she was meant to be. He looked up, eyes haunted. How do you make amends for something like that? Before Mason could respond, a sharp cry from Liberty drew their attention. She was on her feet, frantically nosing at Scout, who lay unnaturally still at the edge of the whelping box. Mason rushed over, heart pounding. The tiny puppy wasn't breathing, his body limp and cool to the touch. No, 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 Mason whispered, gently lifting Scout. No heartbeat. No response. Sarah showed me what to do. We need the heating pad and... Mason, Thompson said softly, his hand on Mason's shoulder. He's gone. Liberty whined desperately, trying to take Scout from Mason's hands, her maternal instinct refusing to accept what seemed obvious. She licked the tiny body urgently, nudging it with her nose. Let her try, Thompson said. She brought back the other one. Mason placed Scout before Liberty, who immediately began the same methodical licking she had used on the last-born puppy during delivery. Minutes passed, hope fading with each second of stillness. I'm sorry, girl, Mason whispered, his throat tight. He was just too small. Liberty ignored him, continuing her desperate efforts, refusing to give up on her tiniest pup. Thompson watched with tears tracking silently down his face. She's got more faith than either of us, he said quietly. The remaining puppies had begun to squirm and cry, hungry for their morning feeding. Mason moved to help them find Liberty. But his movements were mechanical, his mind locked on Scout's still form. This tiny loss shouldn't hurt so much. He'd seen men die in combat, lost his wife to cancer, endured countless battles. Yet this small life extinguished before it truly began cut through all his defenses. The phone rang. Sarah, calling for her morning update. Mason answered, his voice hollow as he explained what had happened. I'll come right over, she said, the veterinarian's professional calm giving way to genuine sadness. Sometimes, despite everything we do, I know, Mason replied. It's not your fault. We all did everything we could. As he hung up, a commotion from the whelping box startled him. Liberty was barking, a sharp, demanding sound unlike her usual quiet demeanor. Mason turned to find her standing over Scout, ears forward, tail rigid. What is it, girl? He asked, moving closer. The impossible happened. Scout twitched. A tiny leg moved, then another. A weak, barely audible squeak emerged from the little body. My God, Thompson breathed. Mason dropped to his knees beside the whelping box. He's alive! Liberty looked at Mason with an expression that seemed almost reproachful, as if saying, Of course he is. I wasn't giving up. They quickly prepared the heating pad, warming Scout's tiny body, while Liberty continued to stimulate him with gentle licks. By the time Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, Scout was weakly nursing, exhausted, but unquestionably alive. Sarah examined him carefully, her professional demeanor belied by the wonder in her eyes. I've never seen anything like this, she admitted. By all medical standards, he was gone. Liberty literally brought him back to life. She wouldn't give up on him, Mason said, watching Liberty curl protectively around her puppies, Scout now securely nestled against her warm belly. Like someone else I know, Sarah replied, giving Mason a meaningful look. The rest of the day passed in a haze of cautious celebration. Eleanor arrived with groceries and stayed to knit tiny blankets for each puppy. Thompson canceled his meetings to help monitor Scout's condition. By evening, the crisis seemed to have passed, the runt's breathing steady, his nursing stronger than before. As night fell, Mason found himself alone with Liberty and the puppies, the others having finally departed. He settled on the floor beside the whelping box, watching the new family sleep. You're something else, you know that? he told Liberty softly. Don't think I've ever seen that kind of faith before. Liberty's amber eyes opened, regarding him steadily in the dim light. She shifted slightly, making room beside her without disturbing the puppies, a clear invitation. Mason hesitated, then stretched out on the floor next to the whelping box, one hand resting on Liberty's head. The contact soothed something ragged inside him, a wound he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what it felt like not to hurt. Sleep came easily, but the nightmares followed. Afghanistan, the explosion, Jack dying in his arms. In the dream, Mason was running, trying to reach his friend, but the distance kept stretching, impossible to cross. Then something changed. A warm presence appeared beside him. Liberty, somehow in his dream, standing alert and confident as she had been in her military days. She led him through the chaos, finding a path where none had existed, guiding him to Jack's side. Dream Jack looked up, recognition in his eyes. "You found her," he said, the same words from Mason's previous dream, now making perfect sense. "Take care of each other." Mason jerked awake, his heart pounding. The room was dark except for moonlight streaming through the windows. Liberty watched him, fully awake, her head raised in concern. Somehow she had sensed his nightmare. "I'm okay," he whispered, stroking her head. "Thanks to you." She settled back down, satisfied he was safe, but kept her eyes on him until his breathing steadied. It struck Mason then, this wounded animal who had every reason to mistrust humans was watching over him, protecting him as she protected her puppies. The realization broke something loose inside him, a dam of grief and guilt held tightly in check since Afghanistan. Tears came, silent at first, then in wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. Liberty shifted closer, pressing her warm weight against him, offering wordless comfort. "I couldn't save him," Mason finally managed, the confession torn from somewhere deep inside. "Jack, I couldn't save him." Liberty rested her muzzle on his chest, directly over his heart, her steady gaze never leaving his face. In her eyes, Mason saw not judgment but understanding, the recognition of shared pain, shared loss, and perhaps shared healing. As dawn broke over the horizon, Mason felt lighter than he had in years. Some essential burden had lifted, not gone, but no longer crushing him beneath its weight. Liberty remained beside him, loyal guardian against the darkness, both the one outside and the one within. Scout stirred, his tiny voice stronger than the day before, demanding breakfast. Liberty immediately attended to her puppies, motherly duties resuming. Mason watched her, marveling at her resilience, her capacity for forgiveness and love despite everything she had endured. In the soft morning light, surrounded by new life and second chances, Mason allowed himself to believe that perhaps some things once thought dead could indeed be revived, including just possibly his own battered heart. 2 weeks after Liberty's rescue, Master Sergeant Harrington returned with a thick folder of documents. He spread them across Mason's kitchen table while Sarah and Eleanor looked on. Liberty, now strong enough to move around the house, sat attentively beside Mason, her puppies safely napping in their whelping box. "It took some digging," Harrington explained, "but we found the complete record of Canine Shadow, Liberty's military service." He pointed to a photograph of a younger, healthier Liberty in tactical gear, standing proudly beside a Marine in desert camouflage. This was her handler, Staff Sergeant Kevin Thompson. Mason studied the image. The young man had Richard's features but softer eyes, his arm draped affectionately around Liberty's neck. "Their record was exemplary," Harrington continued. 37 confirmed IED detections over 3 deployments, credited with saving at least 24 lives. He slid another document forward. This is the after-action report from their final mission. Mason scanned the document, its clinical military language failing to capture the chaos and heartbreak of that day. The patrol, the ambush, the IED that Kevin Thompson had triggered while moving to secure a building that Liberty had not yet cleared. Liberty was working a different sector when the explosion occurred, Harrington said quietly. Despite sustaining shrapnel wounds to her hindquarters and left side, she returned to her handler and remained with him until medevac arrived, protecting his body from insurgents who attempted to approach. Eleanor wiped away a tear. That poor animal. No wonder she bonded with you so quickly, Mason. She recognized a kindred spirit. Mason continued reading, his blood running cold when he reached a particular paragraph. It says here she was transported back to Camp Leatherneck with severe injuries, treated, then scheduled for return to the States for rehabilitation and potential reassignment. Harrington nodded grimly. That's where things get complicated. Her injuries were deemed too extensive for return to active duty. Standard protocol would have placed her in the military working dog adoption program, with preference given to handlers or their families. Which is how Richard Thompson got her, Sarah interjected. Exactly. Kevin's will specifically requested that his brother take custody of Liberty if anything happened to him. Harrington's jaw tightened. Thompson signed all the proper documents, acknowledging his responsibility to provide proper care. 3 months later, he reported her escaped to local authorities. But kept her chained at that factory, Mason said, anger flaring, for God knows how long. At least 8 months by our estimation, Harrington confirmed. What he did constitutes both fraud against the federal government and criminal animal abuse. Is Richard going to prison? Sarah asked. Harrington sighed. That's complicated. He's retained expensive lawyers. Given his community standing and apparent remorse, the prosecutor is considering a plea deal, substantial fines, community service, probation. Mason's fist clenched. After what he did to her? The plea would include surrendering all claims to liberty, Harrington added, and funding a rehabilitation program for retired military working dogs. He met Mason's gaze directly. Sometimes justice takes unexpected forms. Before Mason could respond, his phone rang. Richard Thompson's name appeared on the screen. Mason answered curtly, "What is it?" "I need to come over," Thompson said, his voice tight with an emotion Mason couldn't identify. "I found something in Kevin's storage unit, something you need to see." 30 minutes later, Thompson arrived carrying a weathered footlocker with military stenciling. His face was drawn, eyes red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept. "I've been clearing out Kevin's things," he explained, setting the locker on the kitchen table. "Should have done it years ago, but—" He shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the ways grief could derail a life. He opened the locker, revealing neatly organized military memorabilia, medals, photographs, letters. Thompson carefully lifted out a bundle of photographs secured with a rubber band. "These were from Kevin's last deployment," he said, handing them to Mason. "I never looked at them before. Couldn't bear to." Mason flipped through the photos, typical military snapshots of young Marines trying to find moments of normalcy amid war. Kevin Thompson appeared in many, always with Liberty at his side or nearby, the bond between handler and dog evident in every image. Then Mason froze, his breath catching. One photograph showed a wider group of Marines, Kevin and Liberty centered among them. And there, standing just behind them, was a face Mason knew intimately from the mirror, younger, less careworn, but unmistakably his own. "That's you, isn't it?" Thompson asked quietly. Mason nodded, speechless. He had no memory of this specific photograph, but the timing matched his deployment. Their units must have worked together, perhaps multiple times. "Keep going," Thompson urged. The next photo hit Mason like a physical blow. He was there again, but this time with his arm around the shoulders of another Marine, Jack Brennan. They were laughing at something off camera, Liberty visible in the background with Kevin. "I knew the name Walker sounded familiar when we first met," Thompson said. "Kevin mentioned you in his letters home, said your unit had saved their asses more than once, called you the quiet carpenter who turned into a warrior when things got hot." Mason's hands trembled slightly. "I don't remember meeting your brother. We worked with so many units." "There's more," Thompson said, reaching for a bundle of letters tied with faded string. He extracted one, unfolding it carefully. This was Kevin's last letter home, dated 3 days before he died. Mason hesitated, then took the offered letter. The handwriting was neat, disciplined, the words of a young man who had no idea his time was running short. "Had dinner with Walker and Brennan from 3-5 yesterday. Shadow practically glued herself to Brennan. She's usually standoffish with other Marines, but something about him she really likes. Walker's quieter but solid. The kind of guy you want covering your 6 when things go sideways." The letter continued, but Mason's vision blurred. Jack. Liberty had known Jack, had somehow formed a connection with him in those fleeting interactions before everything fell apart. "You were there the day Kevin died, weren't you?" Thompson asked softly. Mason nodded, memories crystallizing. "Different building, same compound. We heard the explosion, responded to help. Jack was—" He swallowed hard. "Jack was first to reach the scene. He tried to save your brother." Thompson's composure cracked. "All this time, I blamed the dog when I should have been thanking her for staying with Kevin, for trying to protect him even after—" He couldn't finish. Liberty, who had been watching intently from beside Mason's chair, rose and approached Thompson. For a tense moment, the room held its breath. Then, with deliberate gentleness, she placed her head on Thompson's knee. Not quite forgiveness, perhaps, but acknowledgement of their shared connection to the man they had both loved. Thompson broke down completely, his hands gently cradling Liberty's face as years of misdirected grief poured out. "I'm sorry," he whispered over and over. "I'm so sorry." Master Sergeant Harrington cleared his throat, visibly moved. "There's something else you both should know." He pulled a final document from his folder. Staff Sergeant Kevin Thompson was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for his actions that day. The citation specifically mentions that he diverted the enemy's attention to protect a wounded K-9 unit from a different team. He looked directly at Mason. "Your team, Walker. Your dog, Duke." The revelation hit Mason like a thunderbolt. Kevin died saving Duke? Harrington nodded gravely. "And potentially your handler, Brennan, who was incapacitated with a concussion." Thompson drew fire to allow the medevac to reach them. "All this time," Mason whispered, the terrible symmetry becoming clear. "Kevin saved Jack and Duke. Then Jack died later trying to save others. And now, Liberty has saved you," Eleanor finished gently. "Wheels within wheels. Lives intersecting in ways we never fully understand until we look back, until we look." Sarah, who had remained silent throughout these revelations, placed her hand on Mason's shoulder. "It's not coincidence," she said softly. "Not random chance that brought Liberty to you." Scout's tiny yelp from the whelping box broke the emotional tension. Liberty immediately responded, moving to check on her puppies, maternal instinct overriding all else. As the others gathered around the puppies, Thompson hung back, his expression haunted. "I can never undo what I did to her," he said quietly to Mason. "No," Mason agreed, his voice firm but not unkind. "But you can help make sure it never happens to another military dog. That's what Kevin would have wanted." Thompson nodded, resolve hardening through his grief. "I've already spoken to my lawyers. I'm accepting the plea deal, funding the rehabilitation center, everything they're asking for. It's not enough, but it's a start." Mason watched as Liberty settled beside her puppies, Scout now noticeably stronger, squirming his way to nurse alongside his larger siblings. The runt who refused to die. The mother who refused to give up. The broken connections being slowly, painstakingly rewoven. "Second chances," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Sometimes they come in forms we'd never expect." Eleanor, with her nurse's intuition for emotional weather, approached with a cup of coffee. "You know what my Henry used to say?" she offered, her weathered hand steady on the cup. "He'd say that healing isn't about forgetting the wounds. It's about finding the strength to carry them differently." As the revelation settled into understanding, Mason felt something shift within him. Not an ending to grief, not a miraculous cure for his PTSD, but perhaps the first real step on a road he hadn't known existed until Liberty had shown him the way. 3 months after the storm that had brought Liberty into his life, Mason stood at attention in his dress blues, the uniform still fitting perfectly despite the years since he'd worn it. The ceremony was small but significant, held on the parade grounds of the Marine Corps base where Master Sergeant Harrington was stationed. Liberty sat beside him, her coat now glossy and full, the visible ribs and wounds of her captivity healed. She wore a ceremonial canine vest adorned with her service medals and a new patch identifying her as a retired military working dog. At 8 weeks old, Scout sat obediently at her side, smaller than his siblings, but strong and alert, his eyes watching everything with the same intelligent intensity as his mother's. The other 6 puppies had found homes with veterans through a program Thompson had established as part of his plea agreement. The Shadows Legacy Foundation would place offspring of military working dogs with former service members, particularly those struggling with PTSD or reintegration. Colonel James Richards approached the podium, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd of Marines, veterans, and civilians. "Today we correct an injustice," he began, "and honor both the human and canine heroes who serve our nation with unwavering dedication." Mason's gaze drifted to the front row. Sarah sat beside her daughter Lily, who had formed an immediate bond with Scout during visits. Eleanor was there too, resplendent in a blue dress and hat that made her look a decade younger. Even Richard Thompson had come, standing somewhat apart from the others, his face solemn but composed. Staff Sergeant Kevin Thompson and his canine partner Shadow, now known as Liberty, served 3 tours in Afghanistan, the colonel continued. Together, they saved countless lives through their detection of improvised explosive devices. Their final mission ended in tragedy, with Staff Sergeant Thompson making the ultimate sacrifice to protect his fellow Marines. Liberty seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, sitting perfectly still except for her eyes, which occasionally sought Mason's face for reassurance. "Today, we officially recognize Liberty's service and correct the record regarding her retirement. Despite severe injuries sustained in her final mission, Liberty demonstrated extraordinary loyalty and courage, remaining with her fallen handler until help arrived." The colonel gestured, and Harrington approached with a shadow box containing Liberty's service record and medals, including a new addition, the Canine Medal of Courage, the highest honor a military dog could receive. "Mason Walker, as Liberty's adoptive handler and a decorated Marine in your own right, would you and Liberty please step forward?" Mason and Liberty moved in perfect synchronization to stand before the colonel. Scout remained sitting exactly where Liberty had left him, demonstrating the remarkable discipline his mother had already begun teaching him. By the authority vested in me by the United States Marine Corps, I officially recognize Liberty's honorable discharge from active duty and her adoption into your care. The colonel presented the shadow box to Mason, then knelt to affix a special collar tag to Liberty's vest, one that officially identified her as a retired military working dog protected under federal law. Liberty accepted the attention with dignity, her posture reflecting her years of service. When the colonel finished, she looked up at Mason, waiting for his signal to return to position. "At ease," Mason whispered, and Liberty relaxed slightly, though her bearing remained proud. After the ceremony, well-wishers gathered around them. Fellow veterans shared stories of their own service dogs. Children asked to pet Liberty, which she allowed with patient tolerance under Mason's watchful eye. Scout received his share of attention too, his playful antics a stark contrast to his mother's composed demeanor. Sarah appeared at Mason's side, Lily chattering excitedly to Scout, who responded with enthusiastic tail wags. "You clean up nice, Marine," Sarah said, straightening his already perfect tie. Over the past months, their relationship had evolved beyond friendship, though both moved cautiously, respectful of each other's past wounds. "Not so bad yourself, Doc," Mason replied, taking in her simple blue dress and the way sunlight caught in her hair. Eleanor joined them, leaning on her cane. "Well, isn't this a picture?" she said, her eyes twinkling. "The hero, his dog, and his lady friend. Just like one of those Hallmark movies I pretend not to watch." Mason laughed, the sound still somewhat new to him, but coming easier these days. "Don't get ahead of yourself, Eleanor." "At my age, dear," she replied with a wink. "Getting ahead of myself is the only way to make sure I see how things turn out." As the crowd thinned, Richard Thompson approached, hesitation evident in every step. He carried a small wooden box, intricately carved. "Mason," he nodded, then knelt to Liberty's level. "Hello, old friend." Liberty regarded him steadily, neither friendly nor fearful, a neutral acknowledgment that represented significant progress from the terror she had once shown in his presence. "I wanted you to have this," Thompson said, rising to hand the box to Mason. "Kevin made it in high school, won a state carpentry competition." Mason opened the box to find a set of dog tags inside, Kevin Thompson's originals, not the duplicates given to his family. "He would have wanted Liberty to have them," Thompson said. "And you." Mason closed his hand around the tags, feeling the weight of their shared history. "Thank you. The foundation you've started. It's a good thing. Kevin would be proud." Thompson nodded, emotion making further words impossible. He stroked Liberty's head once, gently, then departed with shoulders that seemed lighter than when he'd arrived. As the sun began to set, Mason, Sarah, Lily, and Eleanor returned to Mason's home, no longer the isolated sanctuary of a wounded warrior, but a place gradually filling with new life and purpose. The workshop behind the house had been expanded, now featuring a dedicated space for training service dogs. 3 veterans were already scheduled to begin working with puppies from Liberty's litter once they completed their basic training. Liberty settled on her bed in the living room, Scout curling against her side. The tiny runt had grown into a handsome, if smaller version of his mother, with the same intelligent eyes and steadfast nature. Though the other puppies had found wonderful homes, there had never been any question that Scout would stay with Mason and Liberty. "You should have seen Mason the night Scout almost died," Eleanor was telling Sarah's daughter as they prepared dinner. "That man refused to give up, just like Liberty. Stubborn as two mules, the pair of them." "Is that why Scout is special?" Lily asked, glancing at the sleeping dogs. "Because he almost died?" "Scout is special because he fought to live," Mason corrected gently, joining them. "And because he reminds us that sometimes the smallest among us can have the biggest hearts." Sarah caught Mason's eye over her daughter's head, her smile conveying understanding deeper than words. They had both witnessed too much death in their careers, she as a veterinarian, he as a Marine. Life's fragility was no stranger to either of them. After dinner, when Eleanor had gone home and Sarah had taken a sleepy Lily to the guest room that was slowly accumulating more of their belongings, Mason sat on the porch steps, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Liberty padded out to join him, Scout trailing behind. "Quite a day, huh?" Mason said as Liberty settled beside him, her warm presence as comforting as it had become familiar. Scout scrambled into his lap, still small enough to fit comfortably there. From his pocket, Mason withdrew Kevin Thompson's dog tags, the metal catching moonlight. Liberty sniffed them, her tail wagging in gentle recognition. "We came full circle today," Mason told her, his hand resting on her head. "You, me, all of us, found our way back." Liberty pressed against his side in silent agreement. Overhead, stars filled the desert sky, countless points of light in the vastness. Once their immensity had made Mason feel small and isolated. Now they reminded him of connections, visible and invisible, spanning time and distance, linking lives in ways he was only beginning to understand. Scout yawned and nestled closer. Liberty laid her head on Mason's knee. From inside the house came the soft sounds of Sarah singing Lily to sleep. All around them, the night was peaceful, holding them in its gentle embrace. "We're home," Mason whispered, and knew it was finally true. When Mason found Liberty chained and pregnant in that abandoned factory, he never imagined she would save him as much as he saved her. Their journey reminds us that healing comes in unexpected packages, sometimes with 4 legs and a wagging tail. Like Liberty, who refused to give up on her runt puppy even when everyone else had lost hope, we too can find strength we didn't know we possessed. The connections that matter most often appear when we're at our lowest, linking our past wounds to future healing in ways we couldn't have foreseen. Eleanor was right when she said, "Healing isn't about forgetting the wounds. It's about finding the strength to carry them differently." Liberty's story teaches us that it's never too late for second chances, never too late to build a family of choice, never too late to find purpose again after loss. Each of us, like Scout, has the capacity to grow stronger despite a fragile beginning. Have you ever experienced an unexpected connection that helped you heal from past wounds? What liberty entered your life when you needed it most? Share your stories of second chances in the comments below. Your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.